The smallest all-electric vehicle BMW currently makes is this, the i4. And the i4 is based off of the 4 Series, specifically the 4 Series Grand Coupe, meaning that not only is this going to be incredibly attractive to look at, it's also going to be pretty easy to live with. It makes sense that for 2024, we don't see too many changes to the vehicle itself, more so in options and packaging. But the i4 is at an interesting crossroads because the i3 is rumored to be coming back sooner than later, albeit in a much more conventional layout, and the i5 is also out and available, which it wasn't when the i4 was released. Now, we'll start here on the front because this is still going to be a middle of the road or a sweet spot offering for many, and style is going to be one of the big reasons that you would look at this over some of the other available electric midsize sedans. Up front, we have a very conventional BMW layout, and that starts here with the kidney grille. But this kidney grille is a little bit different than you'll find throughout the rest of the BMW lineup, because to my eye, at least 50% of it here is covered off. And that's because we don't need nearly the same levels of cooling. Now, the fact that everything here is black means that that blocked off area is, I think, hidden pretty well. So for folks who don't want their car to scream, "I'm electric," having that blend in is definitely going to be a plus. Another plus with the other electrics on the market is how aggressive this front end really comes across. Obviously, these headlights are going to be LED, and you'll see that across the i4 lineup, but you will see a few more vertical elements integrated into those headlights than we have seen previously. As far as size goes, well, this falls pretty squarely in the midsize sedan segment. At about 188 inches, that means that this is going to be a little bit longer than something like a Tesla Model 3, but definitely a hair shorter than something like the Ioniq 6. If you're looking at a more direct luxury comparison, the Mercedes EQE sedan is going to be a little bit longer still, and the Porsche Taycan is definitely going to be longer by about 7 or so inches. Now, if you're familiar with BMW configurators, you know that there's a pretty expansive list of options to pick and choose from. And one of the areas that is the largest is going to be in the wheel and tire category. Now, the i4 here is no exception. And this particular model, the M50 with the performance wheel package, is now a 20-inch wheel. It's a staggered setup, 275 in the rear, 255 up front. But on the eDrive 35, that entry-level model, according to the spec sheet, we can go all the way down to a 225 width tire. And that's going to make a pretty significant difference to the overall range of the vehicle. This wheel and tire option, according to the website, will drop you just immediately a 40-mile driving range. And that means that this should be coming out to about 227 miles versus the 260 or so odd miles that you would get with just about any other wheel and tire package except this one. But what you do get with this one is going to be a lot of grip. Not to mention that this comes with an adaptive suspension, which does a very good job of making this electric vehicle, which are generally known for being a little bit harsher, not at all harsh and not really any different from any other BMW that you can go buy today. Moving around back, you can see the pretty traditional aggressive design coming through, and it's certainly helped by things like the performance package that this one is currently equipped with. Things like the carbon fiber inserts, the carbon fiber spoiler, and very much the wheel and tire package makes this look a lot wider, I think, than it is. Not to say that it's a thin vehicle, but it definitely gives it a stance that you don't find on a lot of electric vehicles today. Those wide tires also require a little extra wheel arch, which is sort of tacked on here, but reminds me very much of a, let's say, late 90s, early 2000s M3. And for me, that's certainly not a bad thing. Now let's move on to something slightly more interesting like propulsion, because what's happening here is not overly complicated, but there is quite a bit of variety. There are going to be two different motor layouts, either a single motor rear-wheel drive or a dual motor all-wheel drive. And that's going to be paired with either an 84 or so odd kilowatt-hour battery, or exclusively for the eDrive 35, about a 70 kilowatt-hour battery. That 70 kilowatt-hour battery and the rear-wheel drive single motor is going to get you 0 to 60 in about 5.8 seconds for that eDrive 35. If you get the larger battery, you get a little bit more power, and your eDrive 40 is now going 0 to 60 in about 5.4 seconds. At all-wheel drive, for the xDrive 40, we're now looking at 0 to 60 in 4.9 seconds. And if you move all the way up to the M50, you're looking at 0 to 60 time of a BMW rated 3.7. What's interesting between those batteries is that there's not a whole lot of difference or a huge disadvantage getting the smaller battery. Obviously, your range will go down, but some of your charging characteristics stay very similar. All of these batteries will charge at 11 kilowatts at level 2 AC charging. At DC charging, that smaller battery will be peaked at 180 kilowatts, while the larger battery is at 205. But because the smaller battery is smaller and only charges a little bit slower, its 10 to 80% charge time is 32 minutes, while the larger battery is down to 30 minutes. All to say that it's all pretty similar. Now, one of the big questions with an electric car is always how far can it go? And that's made a little bit more complicated by the fact that BMW has so many different wheel and tire options that do drastically change the range of the vehicle. By and large, you're looking at anywhere from about 225 miles, which is going to be what we find here on the high-end performance model with the performance tires, all the way up to over 300 rated range on the rear-wheel drive larger battery. When it comes to front seat comfort, I have to give this a 9 out of 10. If you can't find a comfortable position, you maybe haven't tried hard enough. We have an 8-way adjustable power seat. We also have things like the extending thigh cushion, which I've definitely appreciated, 4-way adjustable lumbar support, and we can adjust the side bolstering as well. So me being a little bit wider, I was able to expand it. Normally in a performance-oriented seat, things get a little bit tight, but I was able to fit here pretty comfortably. And we also have power adjustable tilt and telescopic steering wheel. Those are all saved to a driver profile, so switching between people makes this very easy to do. Over on the passenger seat, you get most of the same adjustments. The one thing that's missing is going to be that side bolster adjustment, meaning that you do still get things like the 4-way adjustable lumbar and the extending thigh cushion. Now, unfortunately, the back seats are a very different story to the front. First and foremost, getting in and out of the back seat was a little bit tough for me because these doors do not open especially wide. And with this seat set where I would normally have it, which is not all the way back, that means that getting in, there's just not a whole lot of room to do it. Now, I can get myself in here, but I do not fit comfortably. My head is pretty firmly in the ceiling, but if I duck, I can go ahead and sit here. My legs, well, my knees fit, but my feet don't. I kind of have to pizza them to get them in because with this seat all the way down, I don't have any room for my feet to go under them. Moving over, well, it's doable, but we do have a hump here in the middle. So if I wiggle like that, well, as you can see, there's no way my head fits here comfortably, but I certainly could do it. There is a seat belt, and I just would have to straddle the center, well, really what would be the transmission tunnel, but because there's no transmission here, it's obviously a carryover from the 4 Series, which I understand, but just makes this that much tighter. Plus, I'm now interfering pretty significantly in the legroom of the individual to my left or right if I am here center, and if I draw the short straw and I have to go behind the seat that's all the way back, well, we'll give it a go here. Get those feet in sideways and, well, I guess I can fit, but there's no way my knees are actually going to fit here, and there's no way there's a person here in the center if this is how it has to go. I either need to be the person driving or the person up front if we're going to fit 5 in here. Now, one of my favorite things about this performance-oriented electric sedan is the fact that it's so easy to live with on a daily basis, and that's because of this cargo area. Now, no one's going to accuse this of being a wagon, and certainly the profile does not lend itself to being such, but because this is a liftgate and not a trunk lid, we have a lot easier access to all of the items we would generally have in the trunk. But because it's not a trunk, we also have what I think is a very small but very clever piece of engineering in this 2-piece cargo cover, meaning that your items are covered, but you never really have to end up dealing with it because this, if you needed to, is pretty small and easy to maneuver around. And whatever you might have to get back there, it's probably going to be pretty irregular that you need to do so. It's also worth noting that even though these seats folded naturally in a 60-40 split, they are actually a 40-20-40, where the 20 section is its own individual release, so that if you wanted to use it, you can, but it's a little bit easier for what people will use it probably more regularly for, which is a 40-60 split. Moving along to the interior, up here in the door panel, the top and bottom are both going to be in black. Those are both soft touch, but the color you select, in this case a mocha leather, is going to be there for the middle insert. Also tucked just behind that insert is another insert, this one sort of a geometric chain link pattern that I think matches this whole aesthetic pretty well. Above that is going to be your door handle and your fairly standard door buttons. Nothing too much there, but pretty well blended into the rest of the car. Down below, there is a little storage cubby, great for a water bottle or perhaps your gloves. Either way, nice and simple, and a little bit of door storage. Moving on to the rest of the seat, we do have quite a bit of adjustment, just like the driver's seat, but up top, we also get a four-way adjustable headrest, so up and down, as well as forward and backwards. What we don't get is going to be a height adjustable shoulder belt. Obviously there is a shoulder belt, but not height adjustable. Moving up towards the dashboard, in the A-pillar, you'll notice that we have our branded Harman Kardon speaker. This is the upgraded sound system, but the speaker grill down below is going to go unbranded. Normally you would find something here. In this case, they went for a slightly subtler look. The rest of the dashboard remains fairly low key, but maybe a slightly less subtle. This is going to be black, matching that door panel, but there is some stitching that runs along the top here. Just a nice way to break up what is a fairly large piece of black. But then it moves right down into your interior trim. In this case, carbon fiber, to match a lot of the carbon fiber that we do have on the exterior, as well as the silver strip that runs along the door panels right into your hardware. Down below that, we have a bin-style glove box. It is big enough, likely for a tablet computer, but not incredibly enormous. That does make sense because this interior is not especially spacious. Taking a closer look at the infotainment screen, it is nice, wide, and easily accessible. You'll have your button bank essentially down here, music, navigation, your climate controls, home, your multiple app selection. This is going to be where you find most of the things you can change within this vehicle. And on the far right is where I imagine most people will end up spending most of their time, which is going to be the Android Auto or Apple CarPlay. Obviously, you can switch through the different apps that you have, but one thing I very much enjoy is the fact that you can actually use the iDrive controller to move amongst these menus while you're driving. So if you want to make some changes on the road and not either take your eyes off the road for very long or put more fingerprints on the screen than you have to, this is a great way to go ahead and do that. Now, one touchscreen function I imagine not everyone is going to love is the fact that your climate controls are going to be here on the touchscreen. Climate up and down is nice and easy. These are easily accessible, especially within reach of the driver. But if you want to make any other changes, like where the air is blowing, turning on your heated seats, that all has to be done through that touchscreen. No physical buttons for those. If we move over to the driver display, this is a two-screen layout. It is a curved display, so things are always just a little bit closer to the driver. This is something that can be configured depending on your drive modes. So if we move to Eco Pro, we started in Eco Pro. If we move over to Comfort, you'll notice there's a very slight change. It is mostly going to be in the highlights on the outside of that design, but if we move to Sport, things change a little bit more. Now, here in the center, you can change what is going to be visible. In this case, we have content. There is our forward-facing driver view. We can also do things like, well, get rid of most of it or get a very, very simplified layout. We can also make changes to the heads-up display because this is, of course, equipped with that heads-up display, but it is infinitely difficult to capture. Just so you know, there are a few things that you can change there as far as layout goes, but that is always going to be individual preference. Back into comfort mode. On the left here, we're going to have the miles per hour, and on the right is going to be the amount of power being used, not in horsepower, but power percentages. And if you are using your regenerative braking, that is going to be the arrows going down to the right. Moving below the infotainment screen, you'll find your two vents that have manual open and close. And below that, you'll find, well, a very limited button bank. And this is kind of what I would consider the bare necessities. We have your volume knob here on the left, nice and easily accessible, though you do also have volume on the steering wheel. Your tracks left and right, also there on the steering wheel, but things like your emergency flashers are functions you want pretty readily available, as well as your defrost front and rear. So max defrost front and rear, so that should you all of a sudden be fogging up, I do consider that a bit of a safety feature, and the fact that you can easily access it is always a nice touch. Now pulling back, you'll see that there is a cover here, but if I slide that open, what we should find is the cell phone charger. But as you can see, I've turned that into a sunglasses holder because unfortunately my phone does not fit on that wireless charging mat. Just for reference, I have a Samsung Galaxy S23 Ultra, essentially one of the largest phones on the market, and while I was able to technically fit it in there, I literally had to pry it out. Good news is that fairly accessible is going to be a USB-A port and standard 12-volt power, as well as your 2 cup holders. But if you want all of it to disappear and tuck away, you can go ahead and close that back up. Now, that cover is in carbon fiber because carbon fiber is the trim choice, and you can see that here in the center console. All of this is going to be outlined in carbon fiber, but here in the center, well, on the left side, we have, on the top left, some button banks based on basically car functions. So we have your parking sensors and traction control, blue stop start button, which very much is following with the traditional I theme of the electric vehicles. On the left side, your driving modes, Sport, Comfort, Eco Pro, and here in the top right is going to be your iDrive selector. Now, this is nice and low profile, so if you don't particularly enjoy using it, it shouldn't really get in the way, but I found it a nice way to navigate the Android Auto menu while I was driving without having to take my eyes off the road for too long, or having to touch the touchscreen, which is just a little bit farther away with the way my seat is positioned. Moving slightly back from there, we'll find the storage cubby, but what you'll find is that that storage cubby is not only holding my phone because there's no room in the charge port, but that this is fairly small and fairly shallow. Reason being that this is where the transmission tunnel and the drive shaft would go in the standard 4 series, and because this is converted, we don't have a whole lot of room, which is something you do find in a lot of electric vehicles, is a lot of extra storage space. We do have a USB-C port, and that's been nice and easy to use, but I do still wish my phone fit in the wireless charger. As for the steering wheel, there are 2 options, and here we have the M Sport option, meaning it's a little bit more of a traditional wheel design. If you go with the standard wheel, it is a 2-spoke running across the middle there. I do wish I'd had a chance to use that one. Nothing against this M Sport wheel, but the other one looks just a little bit more interesting. On the left here are going to be your cruise control and driver assist buttons. On the right, mostly your infotainment, answer, hang up, voice commands, volume, and track left and right. What we do have hidden here in the middle is going to be the heated steering wheel button, which when selected, it doesn't actually light up like you might expect. Instead, it's going to alert you here that your heating steering wheel is either activated or deactivated. So just a nice way to give you a message without having to put another little light in the middle of this steering wheel. Because this is the M Sport wheel, you'll also find the M colored stitching running along the inside here. That's definitely a nice touch, but again, I would not have minded trying to see the other steering wheel because we have seen this one before. Now it's time to get the i4 out on the road and let it stretch its legs a little bit. And to be frank, here in the M50, that's exactly what it wants to do. It does not take much to get this vehicle motivated to go. And with 536 horsepower and 50 more torque on top of that, well, it just makes sense that the 0 to 60 time on this is low. And it's actually quite a bit lower than BMW stated. The BMW rating is 3.7, however, on an ever so slightly damp surface, I was able to get just under 3.5 seconds, about 3.4 and a half. Another thing that works pretty well is the upgraded brakes that we have on this particular model. And let me tell you, when you are going 0 to 60, not only is it a punch backwards, but 60 to 0 is quite a punch forward. Because on that same slightly damp surface, I was able to get 60 to 0 in just under 110 feet. And that is a pretty impressive feat considering this is not a light vehicle. As a matter of fact, it's on the heavier side, especially for how big it really isn't. But it's well balanced with a front and rear motor, a very low center of gravity, and because this one has the big 275 rear, 255 tires, well, it's got a lot of contact patch and it definitely makes the most of it. The fact that I don't have to get out and turn a wrench to make this more comfortable or more sport oriented is definitely a plus, because between comfort and sport, you can definitely feel the difference. And especially paired with these tires, this is a vehicle that just wants to keep going into the corners all day long. As soon as you get into that corner, you feel more grip than you probably anticipated, and not only is it slightly grin-inducing, but it's motivating to just push it just that much harder. And because of how well balanced this is and the center of gravity, it's pretty clear, at least to me, that this has to score an A as far as handling goes. But what you normally get in handling, you lose in ride quality. And it really depends on the type of vehicle, but we're talking about a car that's supposed to go fast, which means there's normally a trade-off. And that trade-off, well, it still exists here, but it's not going to be as drastic as you might find in some other areas. Between sport and comfort, there is definitely a noticeable difference, and I find myself in comfort mode most of the time because as much fun as it is to take this into the corners, most of my driving happens to be highway, and I imagine yours is not too far off. So that comfort mode is going to do a great job, and you can feel the suspension working, which is generally, well, for me, it tells me that it's doing its job, but I can feel it a little bit more than I think some may be interested in. And that's okay. These are 20-inch wheels. The suspension can only do so much with so little sidewall, but I have to give this an A- as far as ride because, especially for my preference, I like a slightly tighter suspension, but if I wanted more comfort, I would probably be looking at a different set of vehicles altogether. Something you'll definitely notice if you're coming from another quick EV, something like that Tesla Model 3 Performance, a Model Y Performance, or even, say, a Kia EV6 GT, is that this is going to be significantly quieter than those other options. I was not able to get a reading here because I don't have the same equipment that we use down in San Jose, but I can tell you that this is, as far as I'm concerned, an absolute A. Maybe not an A+, there's still a little bit of road noise. I can still hear my tires, but I assume that's going to be this specific tire coming through a little bit more than others. And if I want it a little bit quieter, well, I can close the sunshade, and that does make a bit of a difference. In the mixed driving that I've been doing while I've had this vehicle at home, I've averaged about 2.6 miles per kilowatt hour, and there are certainly vehicles that do worse. And I'll even give it credit because as far as a high performance option, this is still fairly efficient. But it's a noticeable bump lower than the other i4s without this wheel and tire package. The solution is pretty simple. Don't get this wheel and tire option if you want to go on road trips, but if you want to carve the back roads, well, it'd be tempting not to, just because of how good they are at doing that. The i4 makes a compelling argument for itself versus some of the other competition out there, but one of the deciding factors is going to be price. So let's go ahead and take a closer look at that now. Pricing on the i4 isn't the easiest thing to nail down, and that's because it's electric. When we make a big change to a vehicle, chances are the powertrain has a lot to do with that, and we get that here in the i4 by not only increasing the size of a motor, but by actually adding a second motor. And we also have options for larger or smaller battery packs, which are essentially two major powertrain components that we are going to be swapping out. And that's a lot of the reason we see a $35,000 delta from the entry-level price all the way to the top. But this is a BMW, and there are a lot of things you can change and customize on your way there. There are quite a few option packages, and that's also going to lend itself to this pretty large gap. But you'll also see that carries on to some of the other vehicles on this list below, especially when it comes to something like the Porsche Taycan. And I'll admit, I decided not to go down the rabbit hole of the Porsche configurator because I could have spent probably a few weeks in there figuring out exactly how to make it as expensive as humanly possible. But the point stands that this i4 actually falls pretty middle of the road in mostly electric sedans on the market, which really just tells you how wide that range is of what's currently available. Let's start with one of the vehicles that has quite a bit of overlap when it comes to pricing, but I don't think is going to be the most cross-shopped, and that's the EQE. See, BMW and Mercedes are both luxury vehicles, but that Mercedes is a very ground-up electric experience, where the i4 feels like a modified electric experience. The EQE looks like a spaceship, or a jelly bean, depending on who you ask, and inside it feels very future-forward, where the i4 feels like any other 4 Series, and it just happens to be electric. And there are going to be pros and cons for each. One of the other big differences is that on the BMW side of things, it feels like it's trying to elevate your driving experience, where on the Mercedes end, it's more trying to pull you away from the everyday drive. And that's not to say one is right or one is wrong. When it comes to my money, I would probably rather spend the dollar on the BMW because I like that engaged experience versus something that's going to maybe pull me away from it, even though that experience is going to be very nice and very comfortable. Sometimes people want a very heavily padded office chair, some people want a very ergonomic chair, and they're both just down to preference. If you were shopping for the i4, took it for a drive and loved everything about it, just wish it did it better. Well, as long as you've got the pocketbook for it, you can go ahead and move up to something like the Porsche Taycan. You just really have to be willing to make that jump because the $10,000 gap between the highest end i4 and the lowest end Taycan, well, it's not for nothing. And at that point, you are going to lose a little bit because that entry-level Taycan is not going to be as fast or as performance-oriented as the top-end i4. But obviously, it's going to be a different driving experience, and it makes sense that it does so many things better than we get with the i4. It's just a matter of whether or not you think it's worth it. And really the only thing I think the i4 holds out on in this particular comparison is the fact that it does a lot of things really well. And if you look at how much more you have to spend to get an improvement on some of those things, it comes out, I think, with a win. One of the only pieces that really could be controversial is when it comes down to styling, and that's going to be an individual preference. Not to say that I don't like the i4, because I very much do, but that Taycan has its own unique look, and I like the Porsche-ness of it, because it's still a very sleek machine, but brings its own sort of aggression, and that's why it's another win for me. I just, again, don't think I'd be willing to pay for that improvement. When it comes to how does X compare to Y, in any conversation, one of those options is probably going to be a Tesla. So how does the BMW i4 compare to the Model 3? Well, I'll answer a little bit of it now, but I will have another video putting those two head to head for just a little bit closer look. The reality is that I don't think those are ultra competitive vehicles. They both happen to be electric sedans. A lot of people consider Tesla a luxury brand, but really it's doing something very different. And the standout has been electric vehicles being the standout for Tesla, but not necessarily the best vehicles. And BMW is the ultimate driving machine, or at least so it's said. And so those two just don't match up in most categories. The one that gets a little bit closer is going to be performance, and that's going to be the affordable performance that we get in the Tesla Model 3. That's going to have a lot to do with the 0 to 60 times, not so much with the overall driving experience. Which is not to say that the Model 3 is not a good handling vehicle, especially that performance model, especially the updated performance model. But the i4 is going to have a wider range of operation. It's going to be probably a little bit tighter and a little bit more comfortable in most scenarios, even if it's not the quickest 0 to 60, or maybe 60 to 0. I haven't had a chance to test that on the new Performance Model 3, but stay tuned, we'll be getting that as soon as humanly possible. The biggest gap between these two vehicles for me is going to come down to pricing and comfort. And the pricing one is pretty simple. The Model 3 starts a lot less expensive. It also, on the top end, is a lot less expensive, especially considering that the max price that we had listed also includes the full self-driving, which is an $8,000 software feature that I don't think people are clicking a whole lot of at the moment. And if you want to save $8,000, just don't click that box. The comfort argument is not meant to be controversial because the i4 is more comfortable to drive around, especially with that air suspension. But the Model 3 has made not only a number of improvements to its ride quality, but it's also about the space inside, because they're pretty close to overall dimensions. But the reality is the i4 is so compromised based on the original 4 Series design, and the Model 3 doesn't have any of those constraints. I fit in one a heck of a lot better than I do in the other. And the other thing about the space is that one feels a lot larger and the other feels a lot tighter. That comes down to personal preference, and I don't mind a cabin that feels, well, pretty closely wrapped around me. But if you're doing a lot of cruising and you don't want to feel that claustrophobic end, honestly having a bigger open area cabin, especially with a car that isn't a whole lot bigger, is going to be a plus for many. If I was shopping for a premium, luxury, performance-oriented sedan, and I had a budget, it would come down to the i4 and the Polestar 2, because these are both on the same sort of wavelength, although they just go to different ends of the extreme. I don't mean extreme, but if you want something on the simpler side of things, that's going to be the Polestar 2, though not quite as simple or simplistic or minimalistic as we find in the Tesla. And if you want more customizability, if you want more maybe glitz and glam, that's going to be the BMW, but not nearly as far as something like the Mercedes EQE. The easiest way to sum it up is probably that the Polestar is the budget option to the i4, but it doesn't mean it's a bad vehicle. It just means that if you want an adjustable suspension that you don't have to get out of your car to change, then you would want the BMW. The question is, are you wanting to pay for that option, or is that adjustability something that you use so rarely that it doesn't really seem worth it to go ahead and pay more? If you have a tighter parking space, well, that Polestar 2 is going to be the smallest on this list by, well, a fair margin, at least compared to the segment, and it might not even fall into the mid-size sedan category. It might be a compact. It just kind of depends on how you want to measure things. But the space in the cabin is going to feel somewhat similar. Everything's pretty tightly wrapped around you on both of the models, but one is going to feel just slightly less, and that's going to be the Polestar, and I would probably lean towards the Polestar myself for some of those reasons. This is kind of a tough segment to be shopping in because each of these vehicles kind of has its own niche, but I do think the BMW does a really good job of covering, well, as many of those categories as it possibly can, and I do think it accomplishes that in a pretty big way. Now, I wish it was a little bit more electric dedicated, and we'll see that in some of the other models like an i5 or the upcoming i3. I'd like to see how that i4 and i3 compare, but we'll have to wait and see. I do know that if you want your car to be your own, the i4 is going to be one of the best ways to do it, especially on a budget, because you can make a lot of changes without spending a whole lot of cash that you're not going to be able to do in something like the Porsche Taycan, because you're going to have to fork out for it, and you're definitely not going to be able to do on the Tesla, because that comes, one of 6 different ways. Thanks so much for tuning in. If you have any other thoughts, questions, comments, or concerns, leave those down in the comment section below. How would you build out your BMW i4, or what would you get instead of it? Find us on Facebook, Instagram, Threads, Twitter, all those social places, and we'll see you down the road.